So let's talk about clarity. When you're talking with someone, you want what they think you mean to match what you really mean. It can be as innocuous as just asking for some cookies, or it can be as dangerous as getting that tricky magic spell just right. But we always want our meaning to be clear. Unfortunately, sometimes our words don't allow us that clear path to just one interpretation. I'm Moti Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Herzlich willkommen.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
So whenever we run into a sentence, we have to quickly work out what that person was trying to get across. We take their words and we run them through our mental syntax to get out a logical form. That logical form is our first stab at meaning, and in a lot of cases it's all we really need. So for a sentence like, Penny's hair is metallic green, there's pretty much only one interpretation we can get. But with the whole variety of sentences out there, it doesn't take a lot before things start getting more complicated. Ambiguity becomes a real problem real fast. Let's consider something like, all Quentin's friends went to a fantasy land. If you think about it for a second, you'll see that this sentence can mean two different things. It could mean that every single one of his friends went to the exact same fantasy land. Or it could mean that all of them went to some fantasy land, but not necessarily to the same one. So the sentence would still be true if one person went to Narnia, another to Oz, a third to Fillory, etc. As long as all of them made it to some otherworldly destination, the sentence will still be true. So where do these meanings come from? How can the same exact sentence be true in two totally different situations? It's not that any of the nouns or verbs themselves have separate meanings that are making the sentence all ambiguous. And it's not the way we're attaching those nouns and verbs to each other that's causing the problem. The secret here is in those most innocent seeming of words, all and Those little words might seem like they're not that special, but they play a powerful role in how we interpret a sentence. Remember, we have to get a logical form out of any given sentence, right? That's the sort of clear-cut LogicBot 3000 way of looking at things. Well, harmless-looking words like all and actually help map out our possible logical forms. We refer to them, and the other words like them, as quantifiers. Quantifiers tell us what conditions a sentence has to meet in order for it to turn out to be true. Okay, so for a concrete example, let's look back at our sentence, all Quentin's friends went to a fantasy land. How can LogicBot map out all the ways the sentence is true? First of all, that all there tells us that if even a single member of the group stayed home, the sentence will be false. It's got to be everyone. And then the that simple little vowel, it humbly tells us that there has to be a fantasy land out there for our group to visit. Saying a fantasy land is logically equivalent to saying there is a fantasy land that exists, even if it's just, in our imaginations. But wait, so if that's the only role all and have, where do the multiple meanings come from? It doesn't look like that should be ambiguous at all. Everyone went out, and everyone went to a fantasy land that exists. Awesome, end of story. Well, yeah, not really. See, when you put multiple of these logic tools together in the same sentence, they start fighting for dominance. Each one wants to have influence over the whole interpretation. Each one wants to be the big quantifier on campus. In semantics, the influence a quantifier has, its logical power, is known as its scope. So in our sentence, there are two of these logical operators battling it out. It's a question of whether all or is more powerful. If all gets the upper hand, it has scope over That means the fact that all the kids went out is more important than where they went. So that gives us the reading where every one of Quentin's friends went to some fantasy land or another. It could be true if they all went to the same one, or it could be true if they all went to different ones, or anywhere in between. It doesn't matter. As long as they all went, it works, because what matters most is the all there. Since this interpretation matches the ordering of the sentence when we say it, it's known as surface scope. Now, you already know the sentence has another reading, one where all the kids went to the exact same land. So you've probably guessed that all doesn't always end up winning. Could come out on top and get scope over all. That's how you end up with the meaning where there's one single land that all of Quentin's friends went to. Here, the fact that is the most important logical operator is the crucial thing. It means there's one single existing fantasy land that we're talking about. So there's no more splitting up the group. All the kids still have to make a trip somewhere, but now they all have to go to the same place or the sentence won't be true. Because this is the opposite ordering from what we have in the sentence itself, this reading is known as inverse scope. Alright, so all these innocuous words, our alls and uhs and sums and thus, are fighting it out all the time in an endless battle for logical dominance. But if that's true, then why aren't we always adrift in a sea of ambiguity? Why don't we feel confused all the time? It turns out that this comes back to the rules of conversation we talked about before. Because in the end, we're not logic bots. We have this extra layer of stuff we can draw from to make our interpretation, so we can avoid the confusion of our robot friends. We take into account the context, what's relevant, and what would make what the person is saying turn out to be true. This actually tends to follow a pattern, and it's really pretty neat. Let's go through it together. So, for the sentence we've been looking at, here's what you probably did. You thought first that all of Quentin's friends went to the exact same fantasy land, and then when I said the sentence was ambiguous, you probably then worked out the other reading, right? That's because the reading where they all went to the same place is actually true under both possible logical interpretations. If all the kids went to the same fantasy land, then it doesn't matter whether all or wins, because the sentence will be true either way. It's only if some went to Fillory, some went to Narnia, etc., that we require one of the quantifiers to dominate the other. Without any context, we want the situation where it'll be true for the most possible scopes. And that's when they all go to the same place. The interpretation of all the kids going to the same fantasy land is the only one where both versions of the scope relationship are true. And so that's the reading our brain jumps to first. We can usually only get to the second one if we think about it a bit, like an optical illusion. So why is that? What's making our brains decide to pick the most versatile interpretation? Well, it all comes back to those rules of conversation we talked about in topic 2. One of the maxims that sit around inside our brains helping us interpret stuff says, avoid ambiguity. So without even really thinking about it, we reject the interpretation that would be true only in a smaller subset of logical cases. It goes like this. We perceive the sentence, map out all the logical forms, and then we promote the one that makes the most different readings true. At the same time, we keep the other forms on the back burner, ready to be bumped up if we get new input that tells us a given quantifier has to win. And all this in the blink of an eye. Brains. Sweet, amazing brains. And on that note, we've reached the end of the Ling Space for this week. If you were scoping out my meanings properly, you learned that we map out every sentence we encounter onto logical forms to get the meaning. That the different logical pieces known as quantifiers help us know what interpretations we can come up with, that the quantifiers battle it out for which one gets scope over another, and that we prefer the interpretation that makes the most scope readings true to avoid all that nasty ambiguity. The Ling Space is written and produced by me, Moti Lieberman. It's directed by Adèle-Élise Prévost, our production assistant is Georges Coulombe, our music and sound design is by Shane Turner, and our graphics team is Atelier Muse. We're down in the comments below, or you can bring the discussion back over to our website, where we'll have more material on this topic. Check us out on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook, and if you want to keep expanding your own personal Ling Space, please subscribe. And we'll see you next Wednesday. Nascherano!